Hello and welcome to the presidential address by 2020-2021 President Dan Merkle. This session has been pre-recorded. Please use the chat feature in the conference platform for this session to connect with attendees as you watch the presentation. If you are experiencing any technical issues, please email info@aapor.org or contact Pathable Support under the Connect tab in the conference platform with questions or issues. Before we begin, let's take a moment to recognize our 2021 conference sponsors. The support of our sponsors is essential to AAPOR's stability over time. A special thank you to Westat, our sustaining sponsor, and to Recon MR and RTI International, our platinum sponsors. Thank you to our gold sponsors. Thank you to our silver sponsors. And thank you to our other conference sponsors and exhibitors. And now, please welcome Patricia Moy, Vice President of the AAPOR Executive Council for the 2020-2021 Council Year, who will introduce Dan Merkle.
Friends and colleagues, it is my distinct honor to be introducing Dr. Daniel Merkle, your AAPOR President for 2020-2021. Dan Merkle is an extremely dedicated and engaged colleague, and his numerous efforts over the years have enriched AAPOR so much. So it's only fitting that we start this introduction with a review of Dan's service to our association. Dan has served 4 terms on AAPOR's Executive Council. First, as Communications Chair in 2004 to 2005. Then as Conference Chair for the 2012 meeting in Orlando. Then as Counselor at Large from 2012 to 2014. And then as Secretary Treasurer in 2015 to 2016. Dan was also the inaugural chair of AAPOR's Investment Committee. He chaired AAPOR's Financial Oversight Committee and has served on a number of different committees: the Development Committee, the Conference Committee, the Book Award Committee, the Student Paper Award Committee, the Matovsky Innovators Award Committee. Dan has also lent his deep expertise to numerous other efforts in our profession. He has served as an associate editor for Public Opinion Quarterly and currently sits on its editorial board. He was a member of the advisory board of the Encyclopedia of Survey Research Methods, as well as the advisory committee for the Associated Press and ORC Center for Public Affairs Research. And Dan served as both program chair and communications chair for the New York chapter of AAPOR. This year as president, Dan worked unflaggingly with the Executive Council to advance AAPOR on multiple fronts. He'll be sharing this year's accomplishments at the business meeting on Friday afternoon. But today, I'd like to add a personal touch to the story of Dan Merkle. Dan grew up in Norridge, Illinois, a Chicago suburb near O'Hare Airport. The oldest of 3 children, Kay and Werner Merkle, Dan grew up with his brother Thomas and sister Kathy. The 3 were relatively close in age and even closer in spirit. Their close relationship remains strong today, despite the 700 miles between them, and a fun time is had by all, especially Dan, when he returns home. Growing up, Dan didn't aspire to become an election pollster. So when did that happen? Was it in grade school? Definitely not. Dan's father and some of Dan's uncles were butchers. They ran the family business, the Merkle Meat Market. Growing up, instilled with the work ethic gleaned from his parents, Dan thought he too would be a butcher. In fact, his aspirations led him to dress up as a butcher one Halloween. Dan veered away from the meat industry in high school, when he started working in the maintenance department at the Norwich Park District. This was a summer job, and because the park was so close to his backyard, the job was one he kept well into college. While Dan got to work outdoors and acquire a tan every so often, the work wasn't always fun. It was physically grueling, and Dan realized he needed a real career path. So is this when he decided to go into election polling? Definitely not. Since Dan spent most of his free time in high school listening to music and to the radio, he decided he wanted to be a radio DJ. He thought this was brilliant. Why not play music and get paid for it? So junior year in high school, he took a course in radio broadcasting at the local community college. He loved it and really, really, really wanted to work in radio. So when it came time to explore colleges, Dan decided to focus on schools that had programs in radio production. He decided he wanted to go to a small school in a medium radio market. Now, a college advisor would say this was quite strategic on Dan's part. A small school would mean he could get involved with a college radio station immediately, and a medium radio market would afford him the opportunity to secure a part-time job at a commercial radio station while in college. Well, maybe not a commercial one, but quote, a real radio station. For these reasons, Dan decided to attend the University of St. Francis in Joliet, Illinois. Was it at St. Francis where Dan decided to get into election polling? Not yet. Everything went according to the plan Dan had envisioned for himself. During freshman year at St. Francis, he hosted a weekly show on the campus radio station. At the end of the year, he was named Best New DJ of the Year. His sophomore year, Dan was named program director. His junior year, station manager. And at the end of the year, he was voted DJ of the Year by the other DJs. While at St. Francis, Dan also worked part-time at WJTW, a commercial radio station also in Joliet. Dan so enjoyed his time in the control room that upon graduation, he stayed on, intending to pursue a career in radio broadcasting. But within a few months, he quickly realized that even dream jobs in radio were low paying, and he decided it was time to change his focus. To election polling, you ask? No, not yet. Dan's favorite class at St. Francis was Theory and Research in Persuasion, which led him to apply to graduate school. A year later, he had enrolled at Northwestern in its master's program in communication studies. Like many students at Northwestern without funding that first year, Dan had to be creative in cobbling together work. And he ended up as a research assistant for Peter Miller, who directed the Institute for Modern Communications at the time and who became Dan's mentor. Peter's research interests in survey research and the study of public opinion interested Dan immensely, even more so than persuasion and attitude change. In one of their earliest meetings, Peter recommended to Dan that he join AAPOR and attend the next conference. So sure enough, that next year, in May of 1989, Dan got onto a flight, his second flight ever, to attend AAPOR at the Don Cesar in St. Pete Beach, Florida. While in graduate school, Dan met his second mentor, Paul Lavrakis, who ran the Northwestern University Survey Laboratory. Dan secured a job at the survey lab as an interviewer supervisor and a research assistant. And this is where Dan met Sandra Bauman. Their first date was to a poi dog pondering concert at Northwestern. And as they say, the rest is history. Marriage, 2 children, David and Catherine. 2 children, David and Catherine, who kept happy hour at home very interesting. 2 children, David and Catherine, who would soon become David and Kat, who grew up at AAPOR. Making friends with other children of AAPOR. and supporting their dad year in, year out. And sometimes even supporting the AAPOR registration booth. And now David is attending AAPOR this year as a first-time attendee and a full-fledged member of the field. Of course, the strong ties between Dan and his first two mentors remain as strong as ever. Despite what these photos suggest, Dan and Sandra and their children have healthy lives outside of AAPOR. They spend much time relaxing at their lake house in upstate New York, where Dan's family visits yearly. Dan spends a lot of time on the lake, either on the water or on the ice, a hobby born from years of playing hockey with his siblings on their homemade backyard rink. Dan and Sandra also travel around the US to see Poi Dog Pondering perform, and they consider the lead singer a good friend. The photo on the right provides a really nice transition to another activity Dan enjoys, and that's wine tasting and wine collecting. Dan keeps track of all the wine he and Sandra consume, and not surprisingly, given his ties to AAPOR, he does this in an online database that includes tasting notes and ratings. But wait, we never did find out when Dan set foot in the professional world of election polling. It was right after graduate school. In early 1994, Voter News Service was looking for a director of surveys, and Paul suggested that Dan apply for the job. The job seemed perfect, but there was one big problem. VNS was based in New York City, and Dan had never really envisioned living more than 50 miles from Chicago. So when he was offered the job, Sandra said, "Think of it as an adventure. We don't have to live there forever." That was nearly 30 years ago. Dan's first job after graduate school then was working for Voter News Service for Murray Edelman, the man he considers his third mentor. So the answer is 1994. 1994 is the year Dan entered the world of election polling. Interestingly enough, VNS was not his first experience with election polling. That happened during college. While he was at St. Francis, Dan took a job as an exit poll interviewer for ABC News on Election Day, 1984. This was big news, so big that it warranted an article in the campus newspaper. As Dan recounts the story, even though he knew nothing about survey research at that time, the quotes in the article suggest he had the early makings of a survey methodologist. He had no idea what non-response bias was, but he had concerns about it, and he was quoted as saying, "The exit polls cannot be accurate because they are not a good sample of people." The article goes on to explain his reasoning. He had to stand 100 feet away from the polling place. Older voters parked closer to the door at the polling place and were less likely to pass by him, so he couldn't interview them. Dan at the time was obviously not aware of non-response adjustments, but he certainly is now. Dan frequently has mentioned the irony of how he first learned about exit polling through his work as an interviewer for ABC News. A decade later, he worked for Voter News Service, a unit that conducted exit polls for ABC News as well as other networks. And 5 years after that, he took a position as assistant director of polling at ABC News. For over 2 decades, Dan has been at ABC News, moving up the ranks to become executive director of elections, which involves overseeing the decision desk. There, supported by a group of experienced social scientists, statisticians, and election experts, Dan is responsible for election data and projections. At ABC News, he also sets up and enforces survey reporting standards for the news division. He vets surveys and other social science research for the unit, and he provides guidance to correspondents and producers regarding methodology, newsworthiness, and data reporting. In his job at ABC News, Dan has one overarching goal in mind, and that is to get it right. In a year marked by an unprecedented pandemic, a cultural reckoning, a hyper-politicized presidential election, an insurrection, and these are just the prominent issues in the US. Imagine Dan doing his day job and being AAPOR president. It's pretty unimaginable. So how does one try to describe the unimaginable? In undertaking this task, one could conduct an unscientific, non-IRB approved study with a purposive sample of individuals who've had the opportunity to work with Dan in an unspecified period of time. The key question to ask in this study of this purposive sample of individuals who've had the opportunity to work with Dan in an unspecified period of time would be to ask respondents how they'd describe Dan as a president and what awards they'd give him. He has, after all, been winning awards from a very early age. What awards now can we add to Danny Merkle's Congeniality Award? Of course, in a tribute to AAPOR, the researcher would have to conduct a thematic analysis of all of the responses submitted. I didn't have time to do the research, so I hired the firm of Randalls, Summons, and Zubeck to conduct just the study described. And here are some themes that emerged from the data they collected. The first theme they found had to do with ships and storms, specifically AAPOR as a ship navigating this very tumultuous year. Respondents talked about Dan steering the AAPOR ship during a pandemic year, how Dan should be given a Leading Through the Storm award. One person provided detail. Dan was a fearless leader who guided us during a year full of ebbs, flows, and big swells. I am so thankful to have had him at the helm of our AAPOR ship. He will forever be our Captain Dan. A second theme invoked media and popular culture. A number of individuals appeared to be inspired by Cool Hand Luke, the Paul Newman movie from 1967. They referenced Dan as meritorious of a Cool Hand Presidential Leadership Award. Someone even specified the award as being a Cool Hand Dan Award and suggested quotes for the plaque that he'd get. One person said Dan would forever be remembered as President calm, cool, and collected. Another reference to media content came from a quote, AAPOR is better, stronger, and more effective because of Dan. Was that a reference to Lee Majors and the $6 Million Man? One person, recalling that Dan works for ABC News, which is owned by Disney, said Dan's title should be Leader of the Club That's Made for You and Me. The research firm Randalls, Summons, and Zubeck also came up with other awards as a theme. One person commented, Dan should win the award for most likely to answer emails within 1 minute of receipt. Another person gave Dan a pandemic-related accolade. Dan is the best virtual president AAPOR has ever had. And because it's difficult to coordinate 17 people with 17 crazy schedules, Dan also earned the award for being the best herder of cats. The data collected generated a bunch of descriptors like wonderful, fair, meticulous, forbearing, open-minded, great listener, intelligent, clear vision, fearless, respectful, well-balanced, calm, stable, impressive. It was so overwhelming, I couldn't make sense of it. So I asked the research company for a word cloud, and here's what they sent. Yes, a big check mark. Yes, Dan, you got it right, a big check mark. You have been a fantastic leader and partner. It has been an absolute pleasure and privilege and honor to work with you this year. I speak not only for myself, but on behalf of everyone on the Executive Council. And just as you work every day to get it right at ABC, you've done the same for AAPOR. AAPOR has benefited immensely from all you've done. Congratulations on a tremendous year. Please welcome Dr. Daniel Merkle as he delivers the 2021 AAPOR Presidential Address, Resilience and Strength in Challenging Times.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for that introduction. Because I'm recording this in advance of the conference, it's not possible for me to directly respond, but I can say that it has been a real pleasure working with you on council this year, and I look forward to serving with you in your upcoming presidential year. Hello, AAPOR. I'm coming to you from the place I've spent much of my time in the last year, which is my home office. And while it's a disappointment to not be able to meet in person as we've done for each of AAPOR's first 74 years, I'm pleased to be here to offer my thoughts on the past year. This is my 33rd consecutive AAPOR conference, and I hope that on the occasion of my 34th conference next year, we will all once again be able to enjoy AAPOR as a meeting place in person. Thank you for joining us at our second virtual AAPOR conference. It's gratifying to see over 1,100 people attending this year. Your participation and support means so much to AAPOR. The past year will be remembered as a particularly challenging one for many of us, both personally and professionally. A December Fox News poll highlights this sentiment. It found that 67% thought 2020 was a bad year for themselves and their family, a record high. And even more, 78% said 2020 was a bad year for the country. As of the day I'm recording this, over 574,000 people have died of COVID-19 in the US. For AAPOR members, the coronavirus pandemic hasn't only affected us personally, it has had a major impact on our work and how we collect data, with the shift to working from home and the disruption and changes to data collection and field procedures. Today, I want to discuss some of these challenges that we faced in the last year, how we met them head on, and why I'm optimistic about the future of AAPOR and our profession. The title of my address is Resilience and Strength in Challenging Times. With the onset of the coronavirus pandemic last year, like many workers across the country, AAPOR members had to transition to working from home. As a result, this year's Executive Council will go down in the annals of AAPOR history as the only one that has not been able to meet in person. That made some of our work more challenging, but we adjusted well. Council was as productive as ever, and I was continually impressed by how hard my fellow council members have worked and all they've accomplished this year under very difficult circumstances. Beyond the transition to working from home, the pandemic had a huge impact on how we conduct research. AAPOR members and their organizations had to quickly make changes to fieldwork procedures and how data are collected as stay-at-home orders were put in place in March 2020. Phone centers were shut down and telephone interviewing had to be transitioned to remote interviewing from home. New equipment needed to be ordered, shipped, and set up. New procedures needed to be put in place for remote interviewer training, monitoring, and providing real-time feedback to interviewers. In-person interviewing had to transition to other modes of data collection, such as phone, mail, or web. And in the situations where in-person interviewing has resumed, interviewing protocols were revised and new safety procedures put in place. Other types of in-person research, such as focus groups, in-depth interviews, cognitive interviewing, and usability testing had to be moved online. Appropriate platforms to conduct this research had to be identified and procedures put in place to deal with technical issues experienced by research participants. AAPOR held a series of special workshops that chronicled these huge shifts in research practices because of COVID-19 and helped members navigate these changes. And this conference is continuing the discussion with numerous sessions focusing on the conference theme, data collection, measurement, and public opinion during a pandemic. How our profession met these unprecedented challenges and made these transitions in data collection procedures so quickly was nothing short of impressive. Pre-election polling in particular faced unique challenges last year for the November 2020 election, so I wanted to take some time to delve into this. It has been a number of election cycles since I've done pre-election polling myself, but I can tell you that such polling is challenging even under normal circumstances. And the 2020 election was anything but normal. Overall, pre-election polls correctly pointed to a Joe Biden win, but the polls underestimated support for Donald Trump, and the race was closer than the polls indicated. Further, this was the second presidential election in a row in which the state polls underestimated support for Trump. As a result, there was no shortage of dire headlines calling it a crisis, a debacle, a meltdown, and more broadly, a catastrophe for American democracy. The polling industry was called the night's big loser, and some pointedly asked if this was the end of the polling industry. Beyond the headlines, some commentators voiced a more definitive answer to this question. Polling was called dead, obsolete, worthless, a wreck, and irrevocably broken. It was suggested that the polling industry be blown up and that pollsters find another vocation. Most of these assessments were made the day or two following the election, before a presidential winner had been projected, and with vote remaining to be counted in some states that would ultimately add to Joe Biden's margin. Times like this inevitably bring to mind the 1948 pre-election polls. In the book, A Meeting Place, which chronicles AAPOR's history, Paul Sheetsley called it the 1948 election fiasco and an AAPOR crisis. Speaking about the 1948 pre-election polls at the 1949 conference, AAPOR President Elmo Wilson was more sanguine, saying public opinion research suffered a setback, but by no means an eclipse. And 72 years later, I think this is the correct characterization of where we find ourselves after the 2020 election. While the larger than average polling error in the last two presidential elections is a concern, I want to discuss why the dire pronouncements about the state of public opinion polling and our profession in the aftermath of the 2020 election are overblown. It's important to reiterate that pre-election polls face a unique challenge that other polls don't. That challenge is identifying a population that doesn't fully exist until election day, voters. Identifying likely voters was made even more difficult in the 2020 election as turnout rose to its highest level in 120 years, and with the pandemic upending typical voting patterns. To avoid the risks of going to their polling places on election day during a pandemic, many more people voted absentee by mail or early in person than usual. From election to election, typically there have been relatively small increases in the proportion of voters voting absentee or early. But because of COVID-19, we saw the largest jump ever from 40% in 2016 to over 2/3 in 2020. Further, in 2020, there were much larger partisan differences than usual between those who voted early and those who voted on election day. Based on the national exit poll, in 2016, those who voted on election day were only slightly more likely to have voted for Donald Trump than those who voted before election day. In 2020, however, this difference was much, much greater. Election day voters and those who voted before election day were mere opposites of each other. Donald Trump won election day voters by 20 points, and Joe Biden won those who voted before election day by 18 points. The reason for this large shift is clear. Democrats were more concerned about COVID-19 and wanted to avoid voting in person at crowded polling places on election day. Donald Trump, on the other hand, repeatedly criticized mail-in balloting and encouraged his voters to vote in person on election day. Breaking these results down further by separating out mail and early voters shows further differences, with the mail-in voters voting almost 2-1 for Biden and the early in-person voters evenly split, and as I noted, the election day voters going for Trump by 20 points. Because of this, the challenge for pre-election polls in 2020 was greater than usual. Not only did pollsters have to identify who was likely to vote, they had to get the correct proportion of election day voters, mail voters, and early in-person voters, and they had to get the correct vote estimates within each of these three groups. In advance of last year's election, AAPOR put together the Task Force on 2020 pre-election polling to examine the performance of the polls. The task force is made up of 19 academic experts and pollsters, and some of their findings were discussed earlier today as part of this conference. Such evaluations are critical to our field because pre-election polls represent one of the most visible and high-profile applications of survey research. And pre-election poll results are easily compared to the final vote results, so it's apparent when they miss the mark. AAPOR task forces have looked at error in pre-election polls using two main measures, the signed error and the absolute error. Signed error is computed as the difference between the Democratic and Republican margin in the poll minus that same margin in the final election results. A positive value indicates that the poll overestimated Democratic support, and a negative value indicates an overestimation of Republican support. The absolute error is computed by taking the absolute value of the signed error, so absolute error measures how far the poll was off, regardless of direction. In the state level polls, the average absolute error on the margin was 5.1 percentage points in both 2016 and 2020. This is about 1.5 points higher than the average of 3.7 in the previous 4 presidential elections. The average signed error was 3 percentage points in 2016 and 4.3 percentage points in 2020, meaning that the Democratic margin was overstated in both years. The signed error is of particular concern because 2020 is the second presidential election in a row where Democratic candidates have been overstated in the state polls. Some have used this to bolster the assertion that the polls are broken, even though it's based on a time series of only 2 elections. Based on this, it's not possible to say what will happen in the next presidential election. Looking at the signed error historically, we know that it's not uncommon for it to shift in magnitude and direction from election to election. The signed error for the 2012 state polls was in the opposite direction, overestimating the Republican margin by 2.3 points. The signed error was essentially 0 in 2008. It was 0.8 in 2004 and minus 1.9 in 2000. Looking at the national polling error back to 1936, we see that in the 4 presidential elections from 1936 through 1948, the polls significantly overstated the Republican candidates. Then in 1952, there was a large Democratic overstatement. The largest signed error since then was a 6-point Democratic overstatement in 1980, which then was followed by a very small signed error in 1984. In addition, the first real test of pre-election polling after 2016 wasn't 2020. It was the 2018 general election. The statewide polls performed quite well in 2018. The average absolute error on the Senate and governor's races in 2018 was 4.6 percentage points, over a point lower than it was in 2014, and right in line with the average of 4.9 points in off-year elections since 2002. In addition, and more importantly, the signed error in 2018 was non-existent at 0.1. Similarly, the first real test of pre-election polling after 2020 was the January 2021 Georgia Senate runoff elections, and the polls performed very well just 2 months after the presidential election. The average absolute error was only 2.2 points, and the average signed error was 0. So while the signed error in the 2016 and 2020 presidential elections is a concern, it's noteworthy and encouraging that the signed error was non-existent in the next round of polling after each of these elections. As I noted, we've seen fluctuations in the direction and magnitude of polling error historically, and it therefore doesn't make sense to declare the polling industry dead based on the results from 2 elections. I would also like to put the magnitude of the pre-election polling error in perspective. As I noted, the average absolute error in the 2020 statewide polls was 5.1 percentage points. That is the error on the margin between the Democratic and Republican candidates. Cutting that in half yields the average error on the candidate of about 2.5 points, which doesn't sound all that bad given the difficulty in estimating likely voters and the broader methodological challenges that all polls face. One of the main themes of the first AAPOR conference in 1946 was the debate between the proponents of quota sampling and area probability sampling. The pre-election polling misfire in 1948 put even more of a focus on sampling methodology, with the pollsters Gallup, Roper, and Crossley being criticized for using quota sampling. But even 4 years later, at the 1952 AAPOR conference, Gallup and Crossley still resisted the use of probability sampling for pre-election polls. Crossley expressed concern about the response rates obtained when using probability sampling. He said, quote, "No matter who does it, you rarely end up with more than 85% or so of your designated individuals, and these only after several callbacks. You are then faced with estimating the remainder either through additional sampling or through mathematical weighting. Both involve new orders of error," end quote. Crossley's pushback on probability sampling was that non-response was about 15%. At AAPOR's 13th conference in 1948, Burns Roper made the same argument in a session called "Is Probability Sampling Overdone?" Roper took issue with the session title and suggested the alternate title of "Is Probability Sampling Ever Done?" And he expressed strong concerns about non-response rates in the 15 to 25% range that survey researchers were obtaining at that time. I think the AAPOR pioneers on both sides of the quota sampling and probability sampling divide in the 1940s and 1950s would be amazed that the 2020 pre-election polls conducted using non-probability sampling methods and probability sampling methods with response rates in the low single digits would produce candidate estimates with an average error of 2.5 percentage points. Even so, recent research has quantified how much the margin of error calculation underestimates the actual observed error in pre-election polls. Jennings and Valasian analyzed pre-election polls from 16 countries and found the observed absolute error was about 2.5 times greater than what would be expected based on sampling theory. A study by Shinari Mayer et al. Analyzed pre-election polls in the US and found that the average error was about twice as large as what would be expected based on sampling theory. It's not a new revelation that the margin of error only measures sampling error and tells us nothing about non-sampling error. In his AAPOR presidential address in 1983, Burns Roper said that if he were granted one wish, it would be for the media to stop reporting the margin of error because people misinterpret it to be a measure of total error rather than sampling error. Of course, Roper didn't get his wish. In fact, AAPOR's Code of Professional Ethics and Practices explicitly calls for survey researchers to report estimates of sampling error for surveys using probability sampling. We as a profession need to do more to make clear that the margin of error only measures sampling error and underestimates total error. The new AAPOR code, which was approved by the membership last month, takes a step in this direction by adding a new item to the disclosure standards. The list of items for immediate disclosure now calls on survey researchers to include a general statement acknowledging the unmeasured error associated with all forms of public opinion research. This is a first step, but we can and should go beyond this to give better guidance to poll consumers about what level of error can be expected in pre-election polls. The past performance of pre-election polls can be used to quantify and set expectations about the expected range of error. I will be proposing that AAPOR establish a working group to study this and provide more specific guidance about communicating potential error and uncertainty in pre-election polls. This points up one of the big challenges AAPOR and the profession face in our communication efforts: the tension between advocating for the value and accuracy of survey research and at the same time setting realistic expectations about possible error. Throughout 2020, AAPOR worked closely with the public relations firm Stanton on media outreach and messaging, most of it related to pre-election polling. In 2020, AAPOR released 6 statements and press releases on the election and polling and held 3 webinars for journalists focused on accurately interpreting and reporting pre-election polls. AAPOR's media outreach efforts with Stanton resulted in over 350 media mentions of AAPOR last year and the fielding of over 30 interview requests. Many of the questions before the election were along the lines of, should we trust the polls? Are the polls accurate? Being more upfront about the level of expected error in pre-election polls will help poll consumers interpret poll results and better prepare them for situations when there is a mismatch between the polls and the actual election results. It's challenging, but we need to find the right balance between defending the value of polling and setting realistic expectations about pre-election poll accuracy. An unfortunate consequence of the increased pre-election polling error in 2016 and 2020 is the doubt it has cast on all types of survey research. As David Graham wrote in the Atlantic the day after the election, the real catastrophe is that the failure of the polls leaves Americans with no reliable way to understand what we as a people think outside of elections, which in turn threatens our ability to make choices or to cohere as a nation. Fortunately, Scott Keeter and his colleagues at the Pew Research Center recently released a study showing that this kind of a dire conclusion is unwarranted. The title of the study was, "What 2020's Election Poll Errors Tell Us About the Accuracy of Issue Polling." The study presented a simulation of how issue polling estimates would be affected by an overstatement of Biden's margin over Trump. Pew reweighted polling data to correspond to a Biden-Trump margin of 12 points and compared it to data weighted to a 4-point margin, which is how much Biden actually won by. Pew chose to compare to a 12-point margin because that was the highest or the largest lead in a national poll in the last 2 weeks of the campaign. The findings are very encouraging. Across 48 opinion questions and 198 response categories, the average difference between a poll weighted to a 12-point Biden-Trump margin and a poll weighted to a 4-point margin was less than a percentage point. In fact, most response categories differed by less than half a percentage point, and 85% of response categories differed by 1 point or less. The largest difference was 3 percentage points, and this occurred for only 3 of the 198 response categories studied. So even weighting issue polls to an 8-point error on the margin between Biden and Trump only minimally changed the results on issue questions, and substantive conclusions about the state of public opinion were unaffected. And I just want to reiterate that the average signed error for both the national and statewide polls in 2020 was about half the amount used in this study. It can be frustrating for the entire industry, the entire survey research profession, to be judged on the results of one specific type of survey application, pre-election polling. Most survey research is not pre-election polling, and the error properties of pre-election polls may not be generalizable to other types of polling. So if we as a profession don't want to be judged solely based on the accuracy of pre-election polls, we need to do more to provide other measures and metrics. Along these lines, some of the most useful research in our field in recent years has involved the validation of surveys using non-election benchmarks to measure survey error and to compare the efficacy of different survey methodologies. These studies compare survey estimates to benchmarks, which are typically from high quality, high response rate government surveys. The benchmarks can include demographics as well as economic, lifestyle, health, political engagement, and civic engagement measures. Here's a summary of some of the major studies that have compared survey measures to benchmarks. These are measures of the absolute error on individual level and individual response categories. Of course, the level of error varies by the number of factors, including the type of methodology used and also what benchmarks are used. With measures of civic engagement showing more error because civic engagement is strongly related to survey participation. Most of the results reported in this chart exclude measures of civic engagement, so including them would increase average error. On the other hand, comparing to benchmarks like these also likely overestimates error because most of the benchmarks used in these studies are based on surveys which themselves have error. But even with these caveats, I think I think a comparison to the average candidate error from the 2020 election is instructive. As you can see, the average candidate error from 2020 for both the national and statewide polls compares favorably to the error measures from the benchmark studies. Now, given the caveats that I've mentioned, this isn't an apples to apples comparison because of the wide variety of benchmarks that have been used, and they're also and these benchmarks are also very different than candidate preferences. Because there are myriad sources of error in survey research, obtaining estimates that are on average a few percentage points off from the benchmarks is typical and should be expected. Again, it's important to be upfront about this because sometimes we expect too much of survey research in terms of accuracy. None of what I'm saying here today is meant to minimize the challenges facing pre-election polling or survey research in general. The signed error overstating Democratic candidates in 2016 and 2020 is certainly a concern. The work done by AAPOR's pre-election polling task force suggests that non-response is a cause of at least some of the polling error in 2020. The task force's analysis will serve as an important first step in helping us understand what happened with the polls in 2020, and clearly more work remains to be done by our profession to investigate this further. At this time, it's not clear what may have caused non-response bias, nor whether it's a short-term phenomenon or a longer-term concern. A number of hypotheses have been advanced. For example, Donald Trump's messaging may have had an impact in that his frequent attacks on polling may have made some of his supporters less likely to agree to be interviewed. Some have suggested that because Democrats were more likely to stay home because of the pandemic, they were more available to respond to polls. So it's possible that these may be short-term phenomenon that will abate when Trump is not on the ballot or in the post-pandemic era. On the other hand, it could be a broader issue of conservatives becoming less likely to respond to polls in general because of a decline in social trust or for some other reasons. It will take further evaluation to understand this non-response issue and to adjust for it. This may not be an easy task, but if history is any guide, AAPOR members will tackle it head on with an eye toward making improvements for the future. AAPOR has a long history of rising to the challenge and developing methodological innovations to solve research problems. Some pre-election pollsters have released their individual level data sets, but many others have not. It's important for pollsters to release their data sets to allow for a more complete evaluation and exploration of which weighting and modeling approaches worked well and which did not. Some pollsters had more accurate estimates on average than others. At this point, it's not clear if these pollsters with more accurate estimates employed superior and replicable modeling and weighting adjustments, or if they were based on ad hoc decisions that just happened to move the estimates closer to the truth in this election. Access to pollsters' data sets will allow researchers to see what can be learned about the variation in accuracy across pollsters. So I want to encourage pollsters who haven't released their data sets to do so to enable the types of analyses necessary to further advance our understanding of what happened in 2020 and how to improve going forward. I've spent a fair amount of time discussing pre-election polling because that has been one of the hottest topics in the last year. But we all know that AAPOR and our profession are about more than just pre-election polls, a lot more. Similarly, as I've noted in recent years, AAPOR has put considerable effort into evaluating and trying to explain pre-election poll error as part of the 2016 and 2020 task forces. And I suspect AAPOR will need to continue these task forces in the future so as to be ready in case such problems reoccur. And most of the media requests that AAPOR received leading up to the 2020 primary and general elections were about pre-election polling and what changes had been made to improve since 2016. While we've been thrust into the position of having to address concerns about pre-election poll accuracy, and it's important to do so, we need to do a better job in our communication efforts to expand upon and highlight the important work that AAPOR members do outside of elections. Given all the challenges we've faced individually and as a profession in the past year, I wanted to come full circle and conclude on a positive note by highlighting a major area where the profession really shined in the last year. And that is the survey research being conducted on COVID-19. The sheer amount and quality of surveys conducted on the pandemic and their implications have been extraordinary. Shortly after COVID-19 was declared a pandemic in March 2020, the Societal Experts Action Network set up a special COVID-19 survey archive funded by the National Science Foundation and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. This searchable open access archive has been an important tool for policymakers, journalists, and researchers trying to understand and respond to the pandemic. This COVID-19 survey archive currently includes over 1,000 separate surveys from 35 countries, and it continues to grow. It includes individual level data sets, crosstabs, questionnaires, and reports. This is a shining example of the survey profession coming together for the common good, as numerous survey organizations and sponsors are making the effort to provide their survey data to the archive in real time. Similarly, a search of the Roper Center AAPOR database from the start of the pandemic through April 2021 finds almost 11,000 survey questions that have included either the word COVID or coronavirus. To put this in perspective, I ran a Roper AAPOR search from March 1st, 2020 through November 3rd, 2020, the time period in which both coronavirus polling and pre-election polling were in full swing. During this time, there were more than 3 times as many pandemic-related survey questions than there were questions mentioning Trump or Biden. 8,499 survey questions included either the word COVID or coronavirus versus 2,679 questions that included either the word Trump or Biden. This must be the most extensive and sustained level of polling around a single health issue. More important than the quantity of pandemic polling is the impact it has had. It has documented public reaction to this particularly challenging time, and it has provided and continues to provide important and necessary data for government officials, health officials, and policymakers responding to the pandemic and to the news media covering it. This polling has been invaluable in tracking public behavior and opinion about the pandemic across so many dimensions, including concern about getting the virus, COVID testing, vaccine confidence, mask wearing, working from home, social distancing, mental health, stress, willingness to engage in activities, economic impacts, and policy preferences. This work has also been used to highlight important demographic and other subgroup differences in reaction to the pandemic, which has helped in targeting messages, interventions, and resources. Not only is the volume and impact of this work, this survey work on the pandemic, impressive in its own right, what's even more impressive is that it has been done under the most difficult and challenging of circumstances. As we've done over the course of our profession's history, we've met all these challenges head on, and we are stronger for it. I want to thank you for the opportunity to serve as AAPOR's president this year. It has been a great honor and a privilege. I'm proud to be an AAPOR member and proud to be part of this profession. AAPOR members and our profession have shown great resilience in the face of many challenges over the past year. I've seen this resilience in the dedication and work of AAPOR Council and the over 250 AAPOR volunteers who contributed so much to our organization in the past year. I've seen this resilience in the continued output of important and impactful survey research by AAPOR members during this once-in-a-lifetime global pandemic. I'm confident we'll look back on this period in AAPOR's history with pride in how we as a profession not only adapted and persevered, but excelled in what we do best, measuring the opinions and behaviors of the public. Thank you.